My dear brothers and sisters, I'd like to welcome you to your program, Food for Thought. Has any one of you thought about, are we supposed to be different as Christians than the rest of the world? And what does that mean? Why do we need to be different? Today we'll answer that, and we'll try to figure out in what way are we different from the rest of the world. Hopefully that we'll get some meaning to that in our minds. There's no question that all of us at this time and age in our Christianity are facing almost like an identity crisis. Because some people look to us as moralists, some people look to us as ethical people, and definitely in this secular world, it's becoming hard to identify who's a Christian and who is not. But if you would like to figure out who yourself are, any human being, if you look at yourself, what are you constituted of? You have a genetic factor, and then you've got an environmental factor. That genetic factor is what you got from your parents, from your mom and dad. And then the environmental factor is what you have been raised up upon. That what makes you as a person at the end. Very similar to that, in our Christianity, we have a genetic factor, something that we are born with, and something that is engraved in our hearts. But then there are also some environmental factors that then we get raised up. If we try to think about those two together, the genetic factor and the environmental factor, we might at the end understand who we are as Christians. There's no question that if we start with the genetic factor, we have to try to identify ourselves. Do we have something inside us, inside our bodies, that is different than all the rest of the world? And is this thing one of the reasons why we are different and why we're expected to be different? And the answer is yes. If we want to find out, we have to go into the Bible. For any question that we are troubled with, go back to the origins, go back to the basics. Where are the basics? In Genesis. If we all read in Genesis, it was clear from chapter 1 that God created us on His image and on His likeness. And it was repeated several times in Genesis 1 and 2, that image and likeness. That was a genetic code of what was in there. And that genetic code, many people have interpreted in different ways. Regardless of the way that they've interpreted it, all what it means that there was a unique genetic factor in what we were created upon. Interestingly enough, even after the fall, that genetic code was lost. If you look into Genesis 9:6, at that point when God prevented the killing of Cain, even Cain as bad as he was, it was said at that point that he was in God's image, for in the image of God he was created. Unfortunately, over the years after Genesis, humanity lost its mark, and humanity lost its genetic trait that linked it to the image of God. And God had to isolate a group of people called the Israelites. And He told them at that point, from the beginning when He chose Abraham, you will have to have a mark to mark you out from the rest of the world. You'll find and you'll ask yourself the question, why was that mark physical? Why didn't it have to be just an agreement? Why didn't it have to be a verbal agreement between Him and God? But God said, no, you will make a mark in your own body because that would genetically define you than the rest of the other people. And that mark was the circumcision, and you will do it for every one of your children. It was kind of amazing how the children of Israel after that kept that mark and how God was very stringent about it. You hear a very weird story about how when God told Moses to go back to Egypt, and when he was going back with his son who was uncircumcised, God was going to kill the son of Moses whom He told to go back to Egypt. But it was the wisdom of Moses' wife that at that point took her son and circumcised him. And it's kind of interesting, it's almost like ironical, how can you ask Moses to come back to Egypt, but yet you're willing to kill his son? It was because that he didn't have that genetic code, the mark of God on him. Very similar when Joshua, when they crossed the river of Jordan, at that time they had to be circumcised because that mark had to be in their bodies, that genetic code had to be in their bodies. So clearly that genetic mark existed for a very long time, and God wanted to separate us and define us as we are His from the rest of the world. It was not only a physical mark. We clearly read in Deuteronomy 30, verse 6, God will circumcise your heart and the hearts of your descendants. So at that point, that circumcision is not a physical, material mark, but it's a spiritual mark in the heart. And it couldn't be as clear as he said in Leviticus 20:26. You shall be holy to me, for the Lord I am holy, and have separated you from the peoples that you should be mine. God wanted us from the very beginning to have that genetic mark in us, and we have to feel it and know it at that point. It is kind of sad that we look at, for example, the Jews at this point. They're extremely good in remembering their mark. When you look at their feasts, when you look at what they do in their holidays, they keep reminding themselves, they keep reminding their children, you've got a mark inside your body. We have been chosen by God. Even if we don't get into the debate of how are they right or wrong in the chosen people, but they remind their children, they remind their people all the time that they are chosen, they have the mark. Most of their feasts are for this. Yet when we look to us, when we look at how we remind ourselves, most of us forget that that mark exists. The mark that we are special. We are God's own people. So it clearly became to us that now the physical mark is not just physical anymore. It is inside our hearts. It's circumcised in our spirits. So has that continued on in the New Testament? Absolutely. And after the break, we're going to go over that. I'd like to welcome you back in our discussion of how we are different from the rest of the world. We talked about the genetic code that God put into His people in the Old Testament, and how this has continued on in the New Testament with us. You look in John how our Lord Jesus Christ addressed the Father and said to Him, I do not want you to take them out of this world, but I want you to keep them safe. Why? Because they are mine. And He said it clearly in John that I want you to protect them. You don't have to be out of this world, but you have to be identified from this world. You even go forward in the New Testament and you look in Revelation, and how in Revelation it was said that the beast is going to have a mark, and the people who are going to follow him are going to have the mark on their forehead. We read in Revelation 13:15-17, okay, that no one was able to buy or sell except those who had the mark or the name of the beast. So it's clearly at that point that even Satan is going to have his genetic mark, and people are going to be identified with that at that point. You look and then at the end at how they're judged, that those who were deceived, who received the mark of the beast, who worshipped his image, were cast away in the brimstone. And when you look at those who have got the commandment from God, it was for those who had not received the mark of the beast on their foreheads. That is the genetic code that God is looking for within us. And that's sometimes what gets lost. When we start identifying too much with the world, we lose our identity. So, how do we know this mark is in us? Because at this point, it's not a physical mark. It's not about circumcision. It's not about something materialistic that we can see. That mark is only inside our heart. It's just like he said in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, but we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery, the hidden wisdom which God ordained before the ages for our glory. For God has revealed it through us in the Spirit. Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God. So my dear brothers and sisters, that is the first thing in us, that we have to identify what has gone wrong. We have to go back to our origins. Where our origins are, that God has clearly created us on His image. Whether that image means that we are so glorified like Him, whether that image means that He's given us the free will to do and to choose what we like, whether that free image is for us to be kings and priests and holy nation, like was said in Peter, whether that image is for us to glorify Him in everything that we do. If we forget that we were created on His image, on His likeness, we have lost our identity. And that identity is what preserves us and makes us different from anyone else. Clearly at this point, the question is not about a moral or a social gospel. It is not about ethics. It's not about what we're doing right and what being wrong. It's about what do we feel in our heart. I'm not saying that we have to be radically different than the world. I'm not saying that we have to be judgmental against the world. I'm not saying that we have to be extremist against the world. I'm not saying absolutely not that we have to hate the world, but we have to believe in ourselves that we are different. And the first thing that we're different in is our genetic code. So to summarize today, we've talked about if we want to know how we're different and are we supposed to be different, it comes back to two things. The first thing is genetics. The second thing is environment. And I hope I made a case for you today that genetically we are different. And I hope that I convinced you that from the very first plan of God in Genesis, He created us to be His and genetically different than Him. I hope that I got a case for you that this plan has been there from Genesis going through the whole Old Testament until the New Testament. And it's going to be there in Revelation, where people are going to be identified by their mark in them. So let's go back inside ourselves and look inside ourselves. Look at the circumcision of our hearts. Look that we are really special and holy for God. And look at what He has chosen for us. To Him the glory forever and ever. Amen.